Hello! Today I'm continuing my exploration of character designs in Final Fantasy with a look at Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII. Now, like my recent discussion on Squall Leonhardt's design, Lightning and Final Fantasy XIII represent a number of firsts in the series, or at least the culmination of a number of small firsts that Final Fantasy had toyed with, which now came together for a mainline title. For example, while I'd argue that Final Fantasy VI was a uniquely ensemble game, many players reasonably point out Terra Branford as the first example of a female Final Fantasy hero, and likewise in the 2003 release of Final Fantasy X-2, not only does this feature a leading heroine in the form of Yuna, but it also marked the first time the Final Fantasy anthology had begun adding sequels to its formerly standalone titles. So again, both of these things are elements that Final Fantasy XIII would run with through its trilogy of mainline games. So this is worth noting when discussing the evolution of character design and the evolution of Lightning, because the serialization of Final Fantasy XIII and the broad arc that Lightning has across those games impacted her design narratively, symbolically, and indeed as a feature of gameplay, which we will touch on shortly, which made her the biggest canonical evolution of a character's design in the series, which is rivaled only perhaps by Final Fantasy VII's Cloud Strife, and the change he's undergone over the course of the compilation. But jumping right in, and beginning at the beginning with the OG Lightning of Final Fantasy XIII, we have subtle but significant changes in the approach to character design that went hand in hand, firstly with technology, since 13 was the first mainline release on the new and powerful PlayStation 3, and Square really wanted to showcase that, but also I think the design hinted at Square's ambitions for gameplay and action, which we see bear out even in the present day. For example, on the note of technology, and building on what I mentioned around Squall's design for Final Fantasy VIII, Tetsuya Nomura has stated frequently in interviews that he really pushed Lightning's design in terms of detailing, because the PlayStation 3 was so much more capable of rendering expressions, emotions, and the finesse of things like hair and fabric and clothing on its fully rendered characters, and indeed even on the playable field screen. Beyond this, we also had the details that made the approach to Lightning more realistic on the field screen, and also more energetic and kinetic and tangible, and the two features of her design that I think represent this are firstly the scabbard for her sword that is carried right the way through from early concept design into her final rendering in the game, and as I noted in my recent Squall episode again, how the Final Fantasy characters' weapons tend to be abstractly handled, particularly on the field screen, because they are often pulled out of thin air, if they are shown at all, and Lightning is the first instance, excusing Barrett Wallace for obvious reasons, where they have accounted for the weaponry on the character's person across all of their appearances, so the field screen, the battle screen, and of course the FMV cutscenes. So they incorporated it realistically into Lightning's design. They were attentive to the weapon being there, and they considered its practicality in action while running around on the field screen, for example. So it's a very small and subtle thing, but I love that they finally broached that subject and the complexity of handling a character's weapon for the very first time. Secondly, although Final Fantasy XIII was still technically a turn-based game, there really was a push towards fluidity and action and kinetic energy about the characters, and I think Lightning really speaks to this in numerous ways. You know, she's a very energetically and athletically designed character, but what really stood out to me as a flourish and a perpetual nod towards this sense of action is one of Lightning's key design accessories, which is the cape that she wears. And all throughout the game, whether we're running around on the field screen or in battle, we have the movement and the fluttering of this cape behind her that I think really crafts this sense of energy about the characters. And much like Squall's fur-lined jacket, as I recently discussed, it seems that the cape was at least in part a sort of challenge or a showcasing of the programming and the graphical capabilities that were now available on the PlayStation 3. So those are some of the subtleties of Lightning that I loved and exemplify the pushing of the envelope in terms of graphics, technology, and the plausibility of Final Fantasy character designs as time goes on. But coming to the fundamentals of Lightning's design, the most popular description to denote her has historically been the catch-all term of girl cloud or female cloud. And this extends to her general detached demeanour. Her name, like Cloud, like Squall, is taken from a weather event, and indeed her serious facial expression and spiked fringe, all of which I think kind of extends to Cloud, and indeed actually, if we look at early concepts of Squall too. But the moniker of Girl Cloud does extend to her general design approach as well, I think, since like Cloud, she is a soldier, and thus she wears a uniform, but in being a distinctive hero character, the uniform has custom elements that set her apart from other characters in the game, just like Cloud in Final Fantasy VII, and indeed like Sephiroth, who have their own distinct elements while incorporating the essential aspects of the soldier uniform, namely the belt for both characters. So in Lightning's case, like Cloud, she utilises just one shoulder pauldron instead of two, and she utilises the standard issue jacket that flares out a little at the bottom and at the collar, and she also has the standard issue Guardian Core boots. Beyond this, she has largely utilitarian and practical accessories, such as the pockets on her jacket, the pouch that straps to her thigh, and of course the aforementioned holster for her sword, and really the only ostentatious affectation to Lightning's design is the cape that, as I say, kind of billows and has its own sort of aesthetic use there. Now, what we can see from each of these distinguished accessories is the unifying pastel rose colour that even extends slightly to Lightning's jacket, of course her hair, and her boots, and this distinguishes her not only in terms of uniform and her status as a soldier, so setting her apart from the other soldiers, but also in terms of introducing a sense of femininity, which is a defining aspect of Lightning's story, and her uniqueness within Final Fantasy. And I want to stress here that I don't mean femininity, and I don't mean Lightning's feminine because she wears pink, or because, rose pink is a girl's colour, or anything like that, but the very particular hue that's been chosen, that I think is a genius selection for a colour palette, by the way. It has a certain softness to it, so it just simply takes the edge out of what otherwise might have been quite a harsh or overly soldierly or severe looking design. So for example, if we were to picture her with black hair, for example, the harsh contrast between her hair and her light complexion, it would have given a completely different twist to her character that would have taken away something there. So if we look at Fang as a comparison, she has these dark features, these blue tones, and she's much harsher as a character, and it's reflected in this aesthetic. By contrast, looking in completely the other direction, we have Vanille, who again, her colour palette, which is brighter pinks, yellows, it reflects her bubbly persona and being an open book and stuff like that. So Lightning hovers somewhere between these, with her stoic expression, very much like a closed book personality with that Cloudstrife vibe, and a very utilitarian soldier outfit. Yet belying all of this is this pastel rose kind of colour, and I think it hints at the sensitivity and the compassion beneath these traditionally feminine traits that contrast with, her sort of lethal looking attire as a soldier, without kind of compromising it, if that makes sense. So the colour palette of Lightning was just fantastic, in my opinion. And I think this is equalled only by the fact that all of her compassion and these sort of stereotypically feminine traits are geared towards her sister, and her sister Sarah has exactly the same colour palette as Lightning, which forges that connection there and shows the relationship between them in purely aesthetic terms, excusing the narrative. So brilliant work there, and I think the colour selection in Final Fantasy XIII was great. And just a segue, I suppose as an aside, I have mentioned before that even the most unique and uniquely distinctive character designs have something that holds them together aesthetically within a setting, no matter how subtle it is. And in Final Fantasy XIII, not only do the party share some sort of flowing element in their attire, because as I say, Nomura wanted to showcase the kinetic energy in 13. I'm convinced of that, because a lot of our characters have flowing capes, flowing coats as they ran around. They're also joined by the l'Cie mark that they each obtain, but there also seems to be an 80-20 rule applied to colour, where each character has their main colour, but then each one also has a subtle accent of yellow somewhere in their design. So Saz has a primarily green colour, but he has yellow on his coat collar. Lightning's primary colour is rose, but she has yellow on her pauldron. Vanille is primarily a brighter sort of pink, but she has a yellow belt bag, and so on and so forth. Just little bits like this that sort of unify the party. And I did receive a comment on my Squall video about these sort of relationships between design and sets of characters, so I might split this off and do a separate episode on it. Now, coming to the signature weapon of Lightning, which is the Blazefire Saber in the first game, this brings back the Gunblade concept, which first debuted in Final Fantasy VIII, and is personally a concept I've always loved. And as discussed in my Squall episode, Lightning's Gunblade, like Squall's, reflects something about the setting and the world that it's based in, because the super mechanized world of Final Fantasy XIII, where even the Eidolons are these transformer-like mechs that, in the case of Lightning's Eidolon, Odin, transforms from a humanoid self into the metallic warhorse, Sleipnir, and so too do other elements in the game, such as Lightning's Gunblade, have this transformative aspect and dual mechanized function. So unlike Squall's single long-chambered revolver sword, Lightning's weapon will literally fold down into that holster that I was discussing earlier. So again, showcasing a very certain sort of futurism and technology, but also this utilitarian, pragmatic soldier design that she has and carries through. So that's the OG Lightning in a nutshell, really brought to bear this kinetic energy and kinetic design through both her athletic figure and also the accessories that we've discussed here. Very astute colour palette, as I've discussed, that contrasted beautifully the outer hardness of her character, hinting at the inner softness, and elements such as the glowing pauldron, the folding gunblade, all of that sort of thing, sort of just subtly reflected the wider setting that she was operating in, so she is not out of place in the broader world of Cocoon. Now, as I mentioned, Lightning has a very broad arc over the course of Final Fantasy XIII, the trilogy of games, perhaps one of the biggest arcs that we've seen in a Final Fantasy character to date. So I just want to touch on these developments because we can see the transitions and how her design reflects what's going on with her, narratively speaking. So coming to Final Fantasy XIII-2, her design actually sheds quite a lot of the futurism and this mechanized soldierly pragmatism that we've just been discussing in her original outfit, in favour of something that is much more classically fantasy. And as Lightning inches out of the tangible world and into the more spiritual world over the course of her story, we see outfits that more closely resemble classic ideas and images of myth and legend, god figures and things like that. And for example, the addition of her Taj-shaped shield in Final Fantasy XIII-2 conjures ideas of fighters from Greek or Norse myth. Elements of her design are also more organic and ostentatious than her earlier uniform too. So we have this beveled cuirass on her chest in Final Fantasy XIII-2, and this feathered half-cape flowing from her hip. And so a dramatic shift in Lightning's design that very consciously reflects her, as I say, the development in the story, and shedding the futurism and the worldly, technical, mechanized world. And likewise in Lightning Returns, this further ascent towards godhood and her role as this saviour in the story, which pushes us again towards the spiritual and more fantastical elements of the game rather than the tangible, but also the nature of Lightning Returns' story, this sort of quite dramatic end game in an almost literal sense within the setting. And I think her outfit really reflects that in Lightning Returns, because here they've sought to retain her femininity and they've sought to balance this sort of warrior vibe with femininity, but in a radically different way to how they did in the original game. So as I mentioned, in her original outfit we had this soft rose colour palette that sort of went throughout from her hair down on an otherwise military uniform to achieve that balance. But here they've used a much harsher contrast with a fully clad dark aesthetic, which, as I say, creates quite a harshness to her. But what they've done is they've actually accent her feminine attributes. So, the kind of the slight armour around the breasts, the tapering of her torso and things like that. So they've continued to sort of strike this balance between Lightning the warrior and then Lightning as a female. And what I love, and I love this just generally about Final Fantasy, they've never done this in a contrived way. They've always I think, presented strong females. I mean, Lightning is the most important because she is a hero that has carried a trilogy of games. But Final Fantasy have always had sort of strong female characters situated throughout. Freya, Crescent, Beatrix are among my favourites, but there's plenty of them. Beyond this, they've also retained some of the essentials of the Final Fantasy XIII character design, so flowing half capes and high collars and things like that. But overall, it was a very dramatic step change from her original appearance, and I think really showcases not only her arc from where she began to where she's ended up, but also showcasing that high stakes end of days vibe that Lightning Returns has, and I suppose this sort of final stand that her story gives off in that game. Beyond these core design elements, we do, of course, and I have to mention it, we have this cosplaying sort of gameplay design that's available for Lightning, which we also see in Final Fantasy X-2 with the dress spheres. And I'm not sure why the dress up and play became such a big thing and a big mechanic for Final Fantasies that have female leads, but the upshot is that there is a myriad of outfits that Lightning can wear, some of which are practical, some of which are cameos, some of which are comical, and some of which are very cool. Though they are generally, I think, quite well received, and most people I know that enjoyed Lightning Returns enjoyed this mechanic, and could indeed, again, be a conversation unto itself in terms of these game mechanics. I'm going to skirt over them for the purposes of this design review, because they are, again, a more mechanical feature rather than something that was designed to sort of reflect her as a character and as a sort of mainline hero in Final Fantasy. So, in all, we've looked at a very top level at Lightning's design across 3 key games that she appears in, and we've seen how her design has evolved to reflect story, but also reflected the series' first fervent endeavour to have a flagship female lead. And indeed, the entire PS3 era of Final Fantasy was pretty much governed by Lightning. She was a huge figure at the time, and I was talking to someone in the comments the other day about how she appeared on a Louis Vuitton advert. You know, Final Fantasy characters around this time were really starting to transcend and appear sort of in the wider world. And I know Final Fantasy XIII has had a mixed reception from fans as an overall narrative and an overall kind of instalment in the anthology. But irrespective of that, personally, I think Lightning is one of the strongest character designs to ever come out of Square and out of Tetsuya Nomura. I think the balance and duality of her character, the stoicism, the energy and the strength, along with this tenderness and the affections that are buried beneath, are crystallized perfectly in her appearance and first impressions. And both the setting and the stakes of the story are reflected in how her design progresses over the course of the games. And as I mentioned, the kind of shifts in her colour palette, the shifts in her attire, and without any contrivance conveys a competent, edgy femininity that the series had never really seen before or shown before for a central character. So overall, huge fan of Lightning, who successfully carries a trilogy of games over the course of the PlayStation 3's run, and like others, finds her way into Dissidia spin-offs with some additions and alterations that reflects her arc and repute in a more abstract and symbolic way. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And please drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Lightning.